Oh, hi everyone. I'm here with Tia Ho, and it's just been my immense privilege to have had conversations with Tia, witnessed Tia's incredible courage and honesty and love for people and compassion and integrity um, through experiences that have been hard because they've triggered things that have gone on in Tia's past. And so I'm really honored that we have Tia with us now. And so that you, if it's okay with you, Tia, if you would share with us your experiences. I have a lot of questions that come into the podcast and on courses about what do you mean by body work? What do you mean by healing? What does it mean to be present in suffering? And I'd be really honored and we'd be really privileged here to hear anything at all that you'd like to share with us in that respect. So welcome,
Yeah.
lovely. Welcome. I'm so glad we're here together.
Thanks, Claire. I just really appreciate and I'm honored to be invited. And I'll just name that emotions seem to come up a lot
Yeah.
over here, so there may be tears today.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that I think I return back to a lot in in your work and in what's called somatics and even in um, various therapists that I work with is this idea of perceived safety and how fundamental it is as a precursor to the system sort of being willing readiness. There's like readiness and willingness to, if you will, for some of these old beliefs and old experiences that weren't able, they were too much or too fast or um, too big kind of a thing at the time that they happened. And so then the system just used an adaptation to kind of put them over, if you will. And I know that this is all neurological and hard to describe without using metaphors, but um and then those experiences can kind of show up at other times in a meeting, in when nothing else is happening that you would think would activate those memories again, or kind of different sensations. And so um I'm just going to name that one of the things that I experience a lot in your work, Claire, is that feeling of relative safety. And I think it's why um, this system settles enough so that a whole bunch of things can kind of trickle forward. So that was me just explaining that I'm honored, and it's a component of healing that I experience in your work, which is part of why I agreed to the podcast. But
Oh, thank
um I guess if like I was trying to think about your question, um you had asked about me to explain a little bit about body work, and my experience with that term is really from the world of somatics. And so somatics is really this idea that, in my opinion, it gets the closest to talking about the system like the way non-dualist might talk about it.
you.
So it's this idea that there's this body, we each, we're each beings, and then
Yeah.
there's this body, and that body is also a spiritual body. It is a physical body. It is a relational one. It is much more than this idea of separating the brain from the body, or that there's some separate self over here. And I I began working with a somatic therapist about, gosh, I wouldn't say 4 or 5 years ago, and it was a funny timing because I also started reading about a relatively modern paradigm understand that explains how emotions function, called the theory of constructed emotion. And I also met a three principles instructor. We were both at a housing conference together, and we oddly somebody would ask a question about, any kind of situation, and she and I we would have almost the same response to whatever the problem was, right? Which was generally like, well, you have all the knowledge inside of you, to whoever was asking this question of a big concern. And we started chatting I will never forget this conversation. We were just waiting in the airport, and her name is Anna, and she works at the Insight Alliance here in Portland, Oregon. And she brings, kind of this innate wellness perspective to people who are currently incarcerated. And her name's Anna Debenham. And Anna and I were chatting in the airport, and I was like, I was like, well, tell me about what you do and what is this perspective? And I had been meditating for since my early 20s in college, when my swim instructor introduced me to it. And I've had a spiritual practice for a long time. And so nothing she was saying sounded new, but yet there was some way that she was talking where it felt like I still have this. Didn't mean to talk about a spiritual experience in this call, but I still have a very distinct sensation from sitting in that airport. And it was like the whole world shifted, and as though like there were different pieces of puzzles, like the world was like a big puzzle. And then somehow she started talking about things, and these different threads of understanding all kind of reformed, and the whole puzzle shifted. And then some of the pieces that had looked separate before suddenly looked together. And whenever I would go, we still go for walks every once in a while. And every time after I walk with her, it's the oddest sensation. My brain, the mental chatter of the mind just goes away for like 24 or 48 hours. And I'm always like, I text her, what did you do? She's like, nothing. That's all you. That's all you. So that I'm bringing this up because it felt like there were a whole bunch of different things that happened at the same time. So I can't really parse out only the somatic practitioner from, a spiritual kind of Anna sharing some of her understanding with me from other practices I'd been doing. So I just want to name that there are a whole lot of in my experience, there's a whole lot of resources that come in, and it looks like those things are outside, right? But the way it's starting to look to me now is that those resources are sort of these portals or doorways where the reality of who we are, the core, somatic practitioners call it a core self. So I've started thinking of it as the healing space. So for example, if I go into a session with my somatic practitioner, so she's a therapist and she does two different kinds of practices called Hakomi and somatic experiencing. And the basics of them are really simple, although they're challenging to do when you've grown up in a society that tells you to avoid feeling, that feelings are bad and you should stuff them, numb them, avoid them at all costs, right? But she basically will go very slowly asking questions about the current moment, what's happening right now. And there may be some fight with a partner or some meeting at work or what have you. And then the emotions come up, and she works with me, with the system to, as slowly as possible, feel one drop of those feelings at a time. It's called titration, is what they call it. But what's happening is that, just like when I'm with you, Claire, you're holding, we say like holding space, and it may not be something you feel like you're doing, but when you are simply listening from wholeness, listening with love, listening with, noticing if a judgment shows up in your mind, and then feeling whatever that is, because that's a loving space, rather than projecting it outward, then what ends up happening is that, because we're biological forms here, or self-organizing systems, our system will kind of settle a bit. And then that sort of helps train our system to be able to, the capacity expands. It's always there. It's almost like it's forgotten, or it's been, the beliefs that you're not allowed to feel things kind of override the built-in wisdom and the built-in healing capacity. And so then some of that belief kind of nudges aside, and then the core healing space emerges. And so it just feels like when I'm talking with a therapist, it feels like I can only say she had me sit for longer than I expected it recently, in a situation where I was talking about some of my abuse history, and she had me sit with the feeling the way everybody says to do. And then the feeling faded, and I'm like, okay. And then I started talking to her again. She's like, stop, wait, hold on. Let's just stay with the feeling a little longer. And I said, well, the feeling's gone. She's like, okay, let's see what else comes up. And so I just sat with whatever sensations were happening, even though the memory wasn't there and the storyline had faded. And the longer I sat with it, it just felt like I was meditating. And that might be weird for listeners, because if you haven't had a meditation practice, maybe you might have had something else, right? It might be that there's a state you get into when you're exercising, or there's a state you get into when, or it's not you getting into it, that comes in when you're gardening, or maybe it's when you're doing art, or when you're cooking something, or when you're playing with children, or when you're out with, you might have an animal friend that you play with, or what have you. It's just this, it's the core us. It's what we are at our core, before all the layers of negative beliefs come in. And that is like what we really are. And that's what I'm calling the healing space now. And I had thought it would be something sparkly, or I don't know, lofty, or awe-inspiring, or I don't know. It felt very pedestrian. Like, well, okay, so there's sensations coming up, and then there's this, it felt like velvety space is what it felt like to me, when she was like, well, what are you feeling? I'm like, well, it feels like velvety space, I don't know what else to call it. And that's just the core you. And then these sensations come in, and they get honored and witnessed and loved by that core you. And I don't feel like words really work very well for this. But you had asked in an email to talk about somatics, and there are so many different forms of body work, and body work is somatics is a type of body work. And then there are things like that you do, yoga, massage. Like my husband is a massage therapist, and it is very common for him when, they're not talking, there's no therapy on the table, right? He's just rubbing a shoulder or something. And then it will often happen that people cry.
Yeah.
And it used to happen with my voice teacher. I would do voice lessons with her, and then I would be sobbing because there was expression happening. So I think one of the things that I'm really starting to understand about the innate intelligence of the body, and that folks in somatics talk about, is that everyone's system will find resources and adaptations that are part of life, just living, right? And some of those adaptations we might call, they may have negative side effects. So in your language, you often call things like mini reliefs or mini rewards. Well, from my understanding, over here from studying somatics a little bit, those are actually coping mechanisms. They're adaptations for when the belief that feeling bad isn't allowable.
Yeah.
And then the more that we start to realize that you're built to feel, that feeling is energy, your brain is generating these predictions all the time to help the body move around and survive. Like that's its job. The brain, I think of the nervous system as the brain going all the way down to the toes. Like the whole system is working all the time to protect this whole body, right? It is its job. It's genius. It's genius. And so one of the big shifts that's happened in my healing journey is that patterns of behavior that I used to, that seemed really wrong, and there was a lot of judgment around them, now just seem like, oh, well, what else would that, what
Yeah.
else would it have chosen? It could have chosen anything. And these are the patterns that worked for it at the time. And then they'd stop fitting when the belief changes and you can start to realize that you actually do have capacity to feel. It's built into the body. Then it's almost that those patterns just don't seem attractive anymore. And then a different type of pattern emerges, which might include feeling things, or it might feel a little bit and then you kind of pop out of it and do something else. I'm going to pause because I feel like I've been talking for a little bit.
Yeah, so good. This is exactly what I was hoping that you would share with us, because I think it's exactly what people are so curious about. It's brilliant. How one thing I noticed that quite often people coming into the courses, the body is almost alien in many ways for them. They and me included also, in many ways that we've sort of lived in a sort of intellectual plane, and not of maybe often lots of people had a lot of success in that intellectual plane, but it's sort of come at the expense of the body, really, at the expense of the relationship with the physical. What would you suggest for people who are really just at the very start of starting to even allow for any sort of physical to come in?
Well, I lived that life really until my 40s. And
Mm,
so the body didn't feel safe.
yeah.
So because that belief is so strong that sensations are bad and wrong, and there must be something wrong with me because I can't control them. So that was a
Yeah.
mental, that was just running for almost 40 years. I mean, I don't know what my beliefs were when I was a young child, but um, the abusive history in my home are that certain really basic needs and functions were met with it, physical or verbal abuse or both sometimes. So I think that was part of the belief that formed in the
Mhm.
child mind of like, oh, I'm not allowed to feel, I'm not allowed to just be, right. I have to try to control things. And when I learned about the theory of constructed emotion, which is that emotion, so you have feeling states, everybody has kind of a mood in the body, and things like hunger or hot and cold or fatigue, whether or not you're about to fall asleep or something, those are called physiological affect. That's the mood. And that's universal among mammals. It might be, we don't know if other animals feel things like that too, but
Mm.
um, then the brain in each culture will learn from the society around it to create a concept, so a verbal language based concept that helps people relate to each other. So for example, in some societies people might experience the emotion grief in some scenarios and not in others.
Mm.
And the same thing might be true where people might find some situation humorous, and in another situation, it's offensive,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
it's, these emotions are culturally shaped. And so your brain generates these emotions. There's no conscious controller doing it, just like
Mm.
there's no conscious controller making your hormones move, or
Mm.
no conscious controller um, generating the thoughts that show up in the mind. Once I started realizing that I sort of have a history in the sciences, and so for some reason that information was more willing, I was more willing to listen to it than if it had come from another
Yeah.
source, perhaps. But once I started realizing that the brain was just always generating these emotions to try to like get some sort of goal net for the body. And then when I learned from you that the brain creates a self identity, a concept of me as a representation of the body to protect the body, but then it starts to transfer protection over to this thing it's created. It just, stuff started to unravel. And so this is not really directly answering your question, but the reason that I'm bringing it up is that I don't think that there's one specific way for people to get into the body. There's
Yeah.
no one right way. It's going to emerge organically for each individual, and people can just explore what's pulling at them, right? So it might be that there's no way that I can say this where it's not going to sound like some outside thing is doing it, right? So you might go to an art class and find as you're moving your hand that suddenly emotions are coming up, and then there's a willingness to feel the hand or to feel the emotions. Or you might go, I'd lead forest bathing walks, and it's really common for all kinds of emotions to show up when people go out into nature. And there's a whole bunch of science about why that is related to us being biological creatures that have, this is the first time in human history where in the last 150 years or so where we've been so pulled away from nature that I think it's just part of a nervous settling response when you're around other more than human beings, kind of in, I'm trying not to use technical language and right at the moment, but I think it's really just work with what works for you. So for example, I love dancing. Even if I won't go out in public necessarily, I'll dance at home, and I can't help but feel a lot of emotion when that happens.
Mm.
I have a major support for me has been journaling. I will write out my feelings and then I shred it right away. I throw it away or I burn it so that it's not something that is reread and then reinforces some negative storyline.
Mhm.
And I'm just kind of rattling off a few different I call them resources. They're just supports for the nervous system, for the body to start letting some of that sensation in. They talk about it in somatics as titration, and the suggestion is always to go slow and if possible to have someone who supports you. So it might be that, and maybe, not everybody can afford a therapist. So I have, for sure, I don't know how this is going to sound, but like cats and dogs and pets are amazing at being co-regulators of our nervous system. And so they know often when you're not feeling good.
Mm.
And if you're willing to just let yourself feel a little bit at a time, that's just always an opening. So there isn't just one particular somatic. And for folks who feel really like they've been separated from the body for a very, very long time and really, really up in the head, finding any entry point into feeling more, I think, is always a good start because it will just continue to expand in my experience.
Yeah. Oh, Tia, so great to hear you. I could just listen like hours and hours now. It's so great to hear it. Can I ask you, what do you think what is going on? Like, why is it so fundamental that, like, is it the conscious mind experiencing the emotion? What do you think is like the sort of mechanism in a way that why is it healing to,
Feel.
yeah, to feel?
Um, well, I don't know if I have the right answer on this. I will just say that from my understanding from some of the somatic practitioners, there's a perspective that, let's say we're a child and we're going about doing whatever, and maybe a parent says something that is we take as harsh in that moment, right? Like you're you know, whatever it is, like you're not sharing your toys, you need to share your toys. And then so the brain for whatever reason in that moment interprets that as bad, wrong, loss of love. It could mean anything, right? So there isn't any one universal like a situation that one person would call traumatizing, another person, their system will metabolize it and perceive it differently, and it won't necessarily register the same.
Like that
um
word, metabolize is a great word for this, isn't it?
yeah, so I don't think that there's a one straight answer about why that happens. You talk
Mhm.
about it sometimes, like there's genetics, there's also, and that's ancestral, like goes all the way back.
Mm.
Even like the egg before it forms with the sperm, like there's a window of time before that particular egg is released in an ovary, and this, you know, all of the situations that that womb is in, you know,
Yeah.
and the person carrying the womb will
Yeah.
shape that egg before it, like, so it gets really complex really fast. And I don't know if it can be helpful to understand that there are many different ingredients, but one of the things that I used to notice about myself is that it was like I was trying to control those ingredients
Right.
or
Wow.
judge, well, if,
Yes. Yeah.
you know, um,
Yeah.
my mom had a number of traumatic things happen to her body when she was pregnant with me. And so like it doesn't necessarily do any good to for me to try to figure out a way to erase that, you know, like it's,
Oh,
I
no.
wasn't even out of the womb yet,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
on the, you know, on the my father's side, um family members are Holocaust survivors, and that trauma is documented, that will pass down generations about how food is processed by the body. Like it gets really complicated quickly.
Yeah.
So in terms of the, like why do we need to feel to heal?
Mm.
um it seems to be something about how cycles work in the body. So one of the concepts in about our bodies is that they're always in motion, and one of the words for this is called oscillation. It's also called pendulation.
Mhm.
So just like your the heart beats, you know, back forth kind of a thing, and then the breathing will come in and go out. You actually have brain waves that pulse in specific ways, and they move back and forth. And so the idea is that when there's some sort of you know, emotions are energy, and there's some sort of reaction to whatever that is. So go back to the metaphor of the child, and they're little, and let's say somebody says something, and then because of some sort of belief they squash that feeling down. I don't understand exactly how it happens, but for whatever reason, the brain might store this as a memory different from how it would store other kinds of memories,
Mm.
and link it, associate it with meanings about that it's generating about me and about my relationships and about parents and family and all
Yeah.
kinds of things, because that's the brain is just creating associations all the time to help the body survive.
Mm.
And then it's almost like one of the somatic practitioners who has a book I like, and I can give you some book suggestions at the end of this if you want. She talks about it like a scratched record. So it's almost like that thing happens, something comes in, and then the system isn't able to actually complete a full circuit, or it's not able to go back and forth in a pendulation smoothly. It's sort of like it's a speed bump or a
Yeah.
scratch or something in the record. And so that almost becomes like this energetic bump that's in there and can be associated with lots of other scenarios. And then it's just there until there's a moment or multiple moments. Like I have revisited some same memories from different angles many times in
Mm.
various therapy sessions and through journaling and through um, other kinds of practices that I do on my own. And it's almost like there's another layer that will loosen and move through. And it's just the idea of letting that whole circuit complete, or the entire wave to move back and forth, like pick your favorite metaphor, but it's to let that energy release. And I don't know, but I'm guessing that the brain just creates a new association in that moment. So if it created an association of bad, negative, whatever it is in one situation, I know that in reprocessing traumatic memories, when you bring in resources and allow the feeling, you're letting the feelings come into this healing space, that core you that you are, those associations they change. And then suddenly, like, it's really bizarre. I don't know how to talk about it, because it almost feels like it shouldn't have happened or something. Not that the bad thing shouldn't have happened, but that how is this even possible that this
Yeah.
happens, right? That
Yeah.
um and it won't be, I don't want to just conscious of how much my brain will take words and turn them into absolutes and binaries from that history. So it doesn't mean, so for example, if anyone listening tries something, oh, didn't work, this memory is still terrible, it feels really bad, that doesn't mean that you did it wrong. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean that that memory is stuck there forever.
Yeah.
It just, the body has to go at the body's pace. And
Yeah.
one of the things you were doing is you're going really slowly, really gently. Like, one of my favorite things that you do, there was a person on one of your calls who was experiencing a lot of suicidal ideation. And at one point you just said, why don't you just need love right now. Like, that's it. Love. That's it. None of this. We don't need to talk about the self or anything else. Like,
No.
it's that basic, right? Because the system is just going to do what it's going to do in its own time and pattern. And so what I think somatics and body work and a lot of other things is we're just supporting what is already wanting to unfold, and
Yeah.
it happens in its own time. It really does. And I don't mean it like I feel like it can sound so mystical and squishy, but there is a certain amount of mystery in the fact that we're even walking around in these bodies, like, how
Well,
is this happening?
yeah, really, really, like if you stop to think about it, like really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Tia, my lovely, this is amazing. This is amazing.
Thanks,
Is
Claire.
is there is there any last things that you would like to say to people listening about this area?
um you know I would just say, so there are different spiritual practices and philosophical understandings that can get really, they can sound like a lot of rules. And um so I would just remind the listener that your system has been doing this living thing
Yeah. Yeah.
really well
Yeah.
the entire time you've been here,
Yeah.
regardless of I know that there's a lot of judgments that can come with different kinds of behavioral patterns, certain choices that were made, shame. You just had um, a couple of sessions on shame recently, and that's really woven tightly with that idea of the need and the capacity for control.
Yeah.
And so I just want to be mindful and intentional for listeners to just know that, you know, there's just brilliance
Oh,
built into who you are. And even when it looks like you can't understand why this is happening, or how come you made a decision the way you did or whatnot, and just go gently, I think is my encouragement, and to pick a direction. It sort of doesn't, you know, sometimes people will get stuck in indecision. Should I try this thing or should I try that other thing? And if you go down a path a little ways and it stops feeling like it's useful, then you'll choose another path, right? So it's yeah, so I would just be cautious about rules because there's always choice. One of the things people talk a lot about in terms of trauma-informed practices is to remind you that you have choice. So
Mm.
there are always more choices available than what the brain will kind of fixate on.
Yeah.
And if someone's saying something to you that indicates there's no choice, that's an alarm for me, right? And that's why I've, like, when I first started working with you at the very beginning, I remember asking you a lot of questions because I was like,
It's like
Claire,
terrifying for me. Yeah.
are you bypassing things, Claire? I'm not in, I'm out of this. If we're going to do this bypass game, that's not
Yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah.
Like, and you would consistently remind us, like, this isn't an excuse for bad behavior. We're not telling somebody to stay in an abusive relationship, or you know
Yeah.
what I mean. So just being cautious about when you're approaching anybody in any type of practitioner or any kind of body work or whatever, if that's just something that will throw off alarm bells for me, is if
Yeah.
somebody is very all or nothing, or really restrictive rules, and there isn't this kind of opening about options and noticing what's working for you. Because in somatics, we're still going back to noticing what's going on with the body. When does it feel like, okay, this is helping me actually feel something, and stay with it for a little bit, you know.
Yeah. Oh, Tia, I love you so
I
much.
love you, Claire. It feels really weird to be interviewed by you.
Yeah, but so natural. I mean, goodness me, what a gift your knowledge and experiences for all of us. Really amazing to hear you, darling. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for all of your work and the ways that you've helped me grow. I really appreciate
Oh,
it.
well, and back to you, darling. I mean, your rigor, you mentioned all the questions, your rigor, terrifying, but also like helpful for me to be like it helped a lot of precision and like really what how would I really answer Tia like on this one or that one, and yeah, really helpful. Yeah, you're a gift to the world, darling, and I'm so grateful for you. And just keep doing what you're doing, lovely, because you're leading the way for all of us and showing us how to do this with integrity and bring everyone along with you, because you really do that. So thank you, love.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah. Oh, bye, my darling.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye, lovely.